A 13-year-old girl is trapped up to her neck in freezing, debris-filled water. Rescuers, journalists, and cameras surround her. They can touch her face, hold her hands, and talk to her. But beneath the dark surface, heavy concrete has pinned her legs. The water is slowly rising, and the rescue equipment they need isn't coming. How do you look into a child's eyes while the world watches her slowly run out of time? Omayra was a thriving agricultural town nestled deep in a Colombian valley. It sat right beneath the towering snow-capped peak of the Nevado del Ruiz volcano. For nearly 140 years, the mountain slept. Generations of families grew up treating the volcano as a silent, harmless neighbor. But in late 1985, geologists noticed a terrifying shift in the earth. The mountain started to rumble, sending tremors through the bedrock. Scientists mapped out the exact path of destruction if the mountain woke up. They urged the Colombian government to issue an immediate evacuation order for the surrounding valleys. The town of Omayra sat directly inside a massive hazard zone, but the authorities ignored the warnings, claiming an evacuation's too expensive. They went on the local radio and told the citizens to stay inside their homes. It was a bureaucratic decision that sealed the fate of 23,000 people. On the night of November 13th, a heavy storm masked the sound of the mountain. Nevado del Ruiz did not just erupt with fire and ash. The intense heat from the crater melted the massive glaciers resting near the summit. Millions of gallons of freezing water surged down the steep slopes. The water mixed with volcanic ash, heavy rocks, and displaced earth. It created a lahar, a massive, unstoppable avalanche of liquid mud. This flow moved at 30 miles per hour down the canyon. It didn't just carry dirt. The flow carried massive boulders, uprooted trees, and shattered. Just before midnight, the power grid in Omayra failed, plunging the town into darkness. Then, the deafening roar of the mud flow hit the valley. There was no time to run and nowhere to hide. The lahar swept through the town, crushing concrete buildings like fragile. 13-year-old Omayra Sanchez was inside her home with her family when the wave hit. The mud slammed into their house, shattering the walls and sweeping them into the dark. When morning finally broke, the town of Omayra no longer existed. It had been replaced by a vast, suffocating lake, thick gray sludge. Surviving volunteers and Red Cross workers rushed into the wasteland to search for signs of life. Amidst the floating debris and shattered roofs, they heard a faint voice. Omayra was stuck in a pool of freezing, contaminated water. Only her head and her arms were visible above the surface. Rescuers waded into the deep mud, expecting a simple extraction. But when they grabbed her arms and pulled, she screamed in agony. The water was hiding a horrific trap beneath the surface. Her legs were pinned underneath the heavy concrete roof of her own home. To make the nightmare worse, the deceased body of her aunt was wedged tightly around her feet. Omayra was locked into a vice of stone and flesh. She could not be moved. To free her, rescuers needed heavy excavation equipment or a powerful industrial water pump, but the lahar had wiped out the roads leading into the valley. The government had no organized disaster response plan in place. Helicopters could drop small supplies, but they couldn't deliver the massive pumps required to drain the water. Rescue workers had to use their bare hands and small buckets to scoop the water away. But the muddy water was flowing back in faster than they could throw it out. They placed an empty tire around Omayra's waist to keep her head above the rising surface. Then, they were forced to do the hardest thing a rescuer can ever do. They had to stand right next to her and wait. Cases like this expose the devastating cost of human negligence. And if seeking the dark truth of survival is why you watch, subscribe to Evidence Zero, because the footage captured next haunted the entire globe. Journalists and news cameras from all over the world began arriving at disasters. They waded through the mud and aimed their lenses at Omayra. She became the defining face of the Armero tragedy. The entire planet was watching her live on television. For 60 agonizing hours, she remained trapped in freezing water. But her behavior terrified the people watching. She didn't panic or thrash around in the mud. She didn't scream at the men failing to save her. Instead, she remained incredibly calm, displaying a level of endurance that broke the adults surrounding her. She smiled at the journalists. She asked them for a piece of sweet bread and a soda. At one point, she sang a local song to the rescue workers to help lift their spirits. She was comforting the men who were forced to watch her die. But the human body cannot endure freezing, contaminated water forever. The medical reality of her situation was rapidly catching up. Hypothermia was chilling her blood, and gangrene was spreading her crushed legs. Severe pressure on her lower body was triggering crush syndrome. Toxins from her dying muscle were slowly poisoning her bloodstream. Her face became swollen from the immense physical strain. The whites of her eyes turned deep black due to broken blood vessels. A French photographer named Frank Fournier arrived at the site during her final hours. His lens captured the exact moment her strength started to fade. She looked directly into the news cameras, delivering a message to her mother. She asked her mother to pray for her, and she calmly said goodbye. It was a quiet, profound moment of acceptance from a child who knew she was out of time. Doctors on the scene discussed the possibility of an emergency amputation, but operating in deep, filthy water with no surgical would guarantee a fatal infection. Without a pump to lower the water level, severing her legs would cause her to bleed to death in seconds. There was no medical loophole. Every single option led to a dead end. By the third night, Omayra began to slip into deep hallucinations. The lack of sleep and the severe infection were shutting down her brain. She told the reporters she had to leave because she was going to be late for school. She asked the rescuers to help her with her math exam. The men standing in the water with her wept openly. They had begged the government for a pump for 3 days. When an industrial pump finally arrived near the site, it was broken, and the heavy lifting equipment they needed was still miles away. At 9:05 a.m. on November 16th, Omayra Sanchez closed her eyes. She leaned her head back against the wooden debris. Her heart finally stopped. She died surrounded by people, cameras, and microphones, yet completely beyond help. The photograph of her blackened eyes and swollen face was published across the world. It ignited a massive wave of global fury. The public demanded to know why a government with billions of dollars could not deliver a single water pump. They demanded accountability for the ignored volcanic warnings. Colombian officials offered empty apologies, blaming the impossible terrain. But excuses meant nothing to the grieving nation. The town of Armero was never rebuilt. It was declared a massive graveyard, serving as a tragic monument to political failure. Omayra's body was eventually freed, but her mother chose to let her be buried near the spot where she died. A small shrine now marks the exact location in the mud. Millions of people watched her final hours through a television screen. They saw a child face the end with more grace than the world that failed her. They held her hand in the water. They recorded her voice, but they just couldn't pull her out.